Hey everyone, this is Ed Brenegar. Welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Mark Durstewitz.
Durstewitz, yes.
Durstewitz. And we met, I think, a week ago and
Yeah, we can go, yeah.
at an event in Charlotte celebrating the art of William Schickel, who maybe I'll have his son Joe on, hopefully. I've extended an invitation to him. But we met at an event where a film on William Schickel, a documentary film on William Schickel was presented, and then we had a chance to talk for a few minutes, and then we said, "Well, why don't you come on the podcast?" And so here we are having our first conversation, and I'm glad you're here, Mark.
I'm
And
glad to be here.
so
I'm glad to be here.
get before we get into anything topical, tell us a little bit of who you are.
Well, I am a father to two kids that are grown now and three grandkids and a husband to my wife, and hopefully she still likes it. I did a lot of work early in my career as a writer in defense and aerospace. And that was like both sides. That was an interesting thing. The defense wasn't quite so interesting as the aerospace because the aerospace was science. We were learning things. We were learning things we needed to do. And defense was about killing other people. And I had some huge problems, ethical problems as it went on because some of the stuff you work on is the stuff of nightmares. And I managed to get into software, which was much more benign. But the whole while under all of this is my day job. This was keeping food on the table for my family. I wrote, and I wrote a lot. I've written, oh, I can't even tell you how many songs, and probably 50 or 100 songs, um, two rock operas, six novels.
Well,
Story is really important, and people really don't understand how stories affect their lives on an everyday basis.
so tell us what a story is. Let's kind of start at the most basic level. What is a story?
Story is something that a culture builds up over time, and it's designed for social cohesion and inclusion and for things to watch out in the future. You look at like some of Grimm's fairy tales, they fit that mold perfectly. In spite of the fact that they're really dark and really ugly. But the American Indians had stories. All the indigenous tribes have stories. You go to Australia and they have stories, and these are all for social cohesion.
That's a very interesting thing that you just said. Because this is kind of stuff I've been studying for quite some time. And one of the people I came across maybe 10 years ago was a French anthropologist named Pierre Clastres.
Okay.
And I've never met anyone who has ever heard of him. But
Nope.
and he died in a street auto being run over by a car in Paris back in the
Uh,
70s. But he had done his field work in the Amazonian tribes of South America. And what
yeah.
he discovered was um, uh, the organization of the tribe was one where they voted on a person to be their chief.
Okay.
The chief had no power. The chief's responsibility was to generate the the wealth needed to maintain daily food and shelter and clothing and that sort of thing for the tribe. And he was to remind the people of who they are. And that was
Yes.
his major job was to tell the story of who we are, and
Yes.
was supposed to do that on a daily basis.
Some tribes have some stories that go back to before there was language. Dave Matthews, the musician, he spent a lot of time in and around South Africa. I think it might have been from South Africa or one of his parents. I'm not too sure, but he spent some time in the Kalahari Desert with the Khoisan. And the Khoisan have been isolated so long from the rest of the world's population that their DNA is the purest. And while they were there talking, with them, they heard, he heard music in the distance, and he goes, "Can we go see that?" And so sure, they walked over to it, and there was a bunch of people in a circle singing, and he leaned over to his guide and he said, "What do the words mean?" And the guy just laughed. He said, "These songs are older than words." But you
Hmm?
see how it works, though. They were all sitting in a circle. They were contributing to the song, the story, without any language to go with it. You're talking about things that probably went back in one form or another. I don't know, 100,000 years, 200,000 years.
I totally understand that. I did seminars at a big conference, a big church conference in Benin in West Africa back in
Mhm.
1990. I mean, in 2020, excuse me, 2020. And there's about 50 people in my little group. I did it twice, and I had three interpreters. I was speaking in English. One person was translating into West African French, and the other
Mhm.
people were translating into tribal languages. And
Okay, yeah.
one of those tribal languages only had 800 words.
Ooh,
And I asked the young woman who was translating in that language, I said, "So, how are you explaining these high Western concepts like leadership and organization?" She said, "I would tell a story and then I'd tell another story and then I'd tell another story and tell another story." And they get the idea of the
yeah,
thought.
yeah.
That's the most remarkable thing I'd ever experienced. It was fantastic to know that you could cross the barriers of time and space in the telling of a story or in what
Yes,
we're talking about.
yes. And all indigenous tribes have these stories in some form or another. We've been telling stories. Oh man, I can't even begin to say. You go back. Oh yeah, yeah. There's probably stories that rattle around that were documented much later. Around the first millennium, or oh no, even way before that, the first century A.D. and even farther, back like that. When does the story of Gilgamesh pop up? That's a really really old one.
Hmm.
And interestingly enough, it's very similar to our story of Noah. Very similar. Some people say, "Oh, they stole it." No, they didn't steal it. This is a story that evolved over time, and it was general enough that every culture it touched, it could include.
So when you wrote the novels that let's just talk about novels right now. When
Yeah.
you wrote those novels, you're telling a story. What was the instigating idea, the moment or situation that was kind of inspiring you to create this story?
Well, one of them is called the Plane of Remembrance, and it's about elephant poaching, but largely from the elephant's point of view.
Huh.
And and that's yeah, I read Watership Down, and Watership Down had this profound effect on me. At the end, I was commuting back and forth to New York City, for work in the bus, and I finished the book, and I'm like almost weeping in my in my butt seat. It was just such a beautiful end to such a wonderful story. I hated for it to stop, but it really, really stuck with me. And then I started reading a lot about the way elephants are getting massacred for their their tusks,
Hmm.
and stuff like that. So I was like, let me take a shot at that. So I was sitting on the counter in my parents' house. They never stopped me to do it, but they weren't crazy about it. There's a little bit of counter right before the sink, and I always used to like plop down on that little bit of real estate there. And I smoked in those days, which I'm glad I don't anymore. And I was talking to my father about it, and he's like, that's a really interesting idea. And I read a whole bunch of books about the Maasai, and about the corruption in the game wardens, and stuff like that. And I was sitting there talking to my dad, and all of a sudden, bang, the whole thing hit me. It was like three rotating screens, blah, 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 back and forth in front of my vision. And my father goes, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I can see the whole book." And he went, "Oh my God." I said, "I got to go." And I ran off to start typing. Um, that book came very close to publishing many times. The last one was Bob Wyeth of St. Martin's Press up there. I had an agent, and he was on the phone. I'm sitting in the office, and he said, "I love this story. There's this beautiful, sweet aspect to this story, but I don't have a line that'll fit.
Hmm.
And I was like, ugh. You can't tell a story like that without borrowing from other genres.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're dealing about death, you're dealing about carnage, you're dealing about in this case a psychotic Maasai warrior, and a bunch of wildlife biologists who don't know what the heck is going on. Um, it's funny that this whole thing came up. An old friend of mine just convinced me to see if I can get a developmental editor for it to have a look at it. She's reading it right now. Um, but like, okay, I can do it with one book at a time, maybe. And the other four total 1,500 pages. That's a series, and it's a very strange thing, and I'm really not 100% sure where I got the idea. Uh, I'd have to really think back. But it's the loosely thing. This guy falls, an interdimensional gate falls in this guy. It's science fiction, falls into this guy's hand, and when he uses it, he can't control it. And the first place it takes him is heaven during the battle for control between Michael's armies and Lucifer's armies. And he is accidentally instrumental in helping Lucifer fail. And because of this, Lucifer chases him through the next three books, trying to kill him. And it's really kind of a wild ride. I never tried to, I sent out the first one a couple of times, and everybody liked it, but there's always a but. I don't have a line or that kind of thing. And so my wife, who's read them, and my friend Nancy, who's read all of them, one of them gave her nightmares, which is good. That's what I wanted. She's read them too, and they're kind of like, well, maybe let's try the Plane of Remembrance first and see if then we can get the other ones in place. It's kind of a weird thing with me.
They sound like they could be easily um, translated into a TV series.
Could be. It really could be. And we'll see what happens as we go forward. I mean, right now, and it's the same thing with the music. All of our music is stories, and music is supposed to be a story. You listen to Simon and Garfunkel's early stuff.
Yeah.
The Boxer
Boxer,
and
yes.
the Sound of Silence. And all of those really, really good, these really quintessential pieces of music from them are all stories. Harry Chapin, master storyteller. You can get an album by him called Harry Chapin's Greatest Stories Live, and it goes into all the best of them. There's Mr. Tanner, and all this kind of stuff. Everything's got to have a story. Well, when we write rock operas, before we sit down at any instrument and try and begin writing the music for it, we sit with a notebook, and the notebook is a storyboard, and so we go through scene by scene by scene by scene. And even though we've got one now that we're producing, I'm working on the next one. Right before you called, I was actually working on the storyboard for the next one, just trying to get ideas out of my head. That it's all it's a story. In order for a story to work, it has to touch people. People have to identify with it. And if they don't identify with it, you've told the story badly.
Well, there's always some hook there that draws
Yeah.
certain people into the story because it's representative of something they've experienced in their life. And
Yes. Yes. The one that we're producing now, and our label's trying to get us shows in Europe. The one that we're producing now is called Water Incorporated, and we were able to using water as the mechanism distill climate change down into 8 characters.
hmm,
And that was the most fascinating aspect of the whole story writing process. We wrote like six editions of it, handed it all to our actor friends up north, and had them read it back to us. And then finally, as part of that process, we got one that we could work with, and we started working with that. But yeah, how do you bring climate change down to the consequences of it down to such a small group of people? And that was the big problem, not a problem, but a big challenge with this. And each of the characters, they fit a certain spot in the plot.
Well, at that high level, climate change is just an abstraction. But if you can translate it into a story about people, then it becomes something real, something that they can
Yeah,
identify with.
yeah. And what we did was we all sat down and said, okay, climate change. How are we going to do this? We had to find a mechanism, but we could pressurize the story because when you've got drama, okay, you've got a really good story. So we couldn't make it air because then it would last only like 2 minutes. And we couldn't make it food because that'd be 40 days or so like that. Everybody settled on water and you can live, 3 to 5 days, without water. So it's something that everybody would understand because everybody gets thirsty.
Hmm.
And it's about this woman whose farms are on top of the last clean freshwater aquifer. And this man who owns a company that wants to water, which happens all over the place now, and this dreadful secret that they have. And that's how we build the thing. And when I shipped it off to the label in Germany, they went, "Wow!"
Hey, that's the backstory of Jack Nicholson's movie Chinatown.
Yes, yes, and a film by Robert Redford called the Milagro Beanfield War.
Yeah, that was a great
It,
movie too. It's a
I
great
didn't
book.
I didn't know what was going on. When I looked at the title, I was like, what the heck is this? And my father goes, you need to watch this. And we sat down and watched it. And I was like, oh my God, this is a great film. There's another one in Spanish called Tambien Lluvia, which translates to Even the Rain. And it's about Bechtel taking over the water supply of Bolivia
Mhm.
and how badly that goes. And I won't spoil it for you, but watch it. It's a tremendous film. I'm pretty sure you can get an English overdub now. But these are stories that need to be told. People need to be able to feel it themselves. They need to be able to look around at their environment and go, aha. They have that aha moment. And there it is over there, and hopefully they're inspired to act.
So, where are these rock operas being produced?
Well, right now we've got a show coming up next summer with the Postmortem Players out in uh, Concord that we're gearing up for. We're waiting for some information for that, and then I got to give it the label. And that's it for now. Based on how that goes, then we'll discuss further things. The label is trying to get us booked in London with the show. And the politics of the day are not helping.
Yeah, I
you know,
understand that.
yeah, so we're working on it. He's working on it. I'm working on opportunities over here. He's working on opportunities over there. We'll get it figured out.
There's a story there. I mean, with the
Yes,
politics today. I mean, there are stories everywhere you turn.
there are. And when you're talking about environment, there is a book that is the book that started the entire environmental movement in the United States. It's Rachel Carson's Silent
Silent
Spring.
Spring. Yeah.
And it's about DDT. But the
Yeah.
but the information that the DDT would spread right through the food chain and get all the way up to the bald eagle, our national symbol, and make its eggs so fragile that they couldn't sit on them without breaking them. Once the public saw that the golden eagle was headed for extinction with this, that's when everybody freaked out and decided to do something. You know, we need these things. There's a phrase we use: artists are society's immune system.
Yeah. I remember when her book came out. I was a kid at the time, but it had an immediate effect upon the world.
Oh yeah, you read it, it's like, oh my God, we are in so much trouble. you know, there's so many. I was going through a bunch of them. While I was drinking my coffee this morning. There's another book that people should read for its story, and this is especially poignant to this time. It's Hiroshima by John Hershey.
Mhm.
It's a small book. It's only probably about that thick. You won't be able to put it down. And you will never look at war or the atomic bomb in the same way ever.
Yeah.
This is something that the people have to transmit up the line, to their leaders. this is the way we take the immune system from the world around us and do something with it. And it's very that's one of the things that's so good about stories. Stories do this. People read a story like 1984 or something like that, and they immediately become suspicious, you know, which may not be a good thing, but they're suspicious as regards their government. The same with Aldous Huxley's Strange New World.
Brave
You know,
New World.
there's all of yeah, there's all of these books. Incidentally, as an aside, I went to a what do you call it? Dinner with the World Hunger Year up in New York, and I ended up sitting next to Aldous Huxley's granddaughter.
How about that?
We had a blast. She's a really funny, really intelligent lady, and all these stories she's telling me.
So, what was she trying to carry on her grandfather's work?
No, didn't want anything to do with it.
You didn't want to have anything to do with it, huh? Huh.
No, she didn't want anything to do with it. But you know, it was funny. I said, I bet stuff is weird in your house. She went, oh yeah.
You know that the some of the greatest stories are about families,
Yes,
and I've
grapes of wrath.
done writing my first novel, and it's about I'm setting it inside of a family,
Hmm.
and it's really about the time and the time between different generations, and
Yeah,
um, I'm at the very beginning, so I'm just putting the pieces together. But
yeah,
just to think about this as a story, a compelling story to read because it says something to us. It communicates something that we know intuitively, but don't have necessarily the language to describe. I think that's the challenge that most of us who are writers have. So that's yeah, we'll see what happens with it.
I think you'll have some good luck there because the family is kind of a universal, construct, and everybody's got one, whether they like it or not. And this whole dynamic that plays out, in families, I've seen good dynamics in families, and I've seen unbelievably bad dynamics in families. So you've got a good, really good thing to start with there. You've got a really good nut to to
Well,
go on.
you have to be honest about what actually families experience and what
Yeah,
the individuals within the family experience. And you could have, set of brothers and sisters who all have a different experience of living with the parents that they were born to. And, that's part of the interesting thing about kind of writing a story about families is that there are many more stories than are needed for the story itself, but that's where where the decision as to so what is the central conflict here?
yeah, yeah. You need a center, or as Chris being an actor, she studied acting with a woman in New York City for a long time, and she's just recently found a masterclass teacher down here. But the woman in New York City, her father founded the Actors Studio.
Ah,
So Maggie's got, Maggie really knows what she's doing. And when discussing characters, Chris would take music into to them before we record something. Like, how can I do this accurately, in an emotional way? And she would go over the song with Maggie, and they'd get the whole thing, perked out. But Maggie was always asked, "What's the character's super objective?" Which is the same thing as the big part of the conflict. That super objective is everything to that character, and you have to kind of slice it up. So there's a bit here and a bit here and a bit there and a bit there. It's not only is it necessary, and not only are we the immune system, but it's great fun. It's great fun.
well, I wrote the first chapter and then I
Cool.
rewrote it two more times,
Yep.
and I liked what I was doing. Then I said, I don't know what I'm doing, and so I have begun to sit down to create the actual characters and write their stories
Yeah.
that I will, and so they will become my sort of my neighbors, and I'll be
Okay.
talking to my neighbors as I write the stories. and they will enter into the story as it seems appropriate based on how I have drawn those characters out.
Yeah,
That makes
yeah.
sense to you, doesn't it? Yeah.
It makes perfect sense to me. I have a dear old friend who lives up in New York State in a beautiful little town called High Falls, and he was our live stage director for the first rock opera for quite as we did a regional tour, through the area, and because we're just getting our feet wet and we're just figuring out how to do this, and he was with us for that 10 years or so, and he was he's a stay-at-home dad because his wife has this really really good job, and Obi's a writer and a director and that kind of thing. But he was telling me once that he walks around the house in the character that he's working on, speaks like the character, says the things that the characters like to say. And I said, what do the kids do? She goes, oh, they laugh at me. They stand around and laugh.
Oh, that just inspired me. I mean, that, okay. Now I got another wrinkle to work on.
He's really something, and a really cool guy. He's written a lot of plays, and I've seen most of them, and they're exquisitely well put together. They really are.
So when you're creating these rock operas, are you doing everything of it? Are you doing the music as well as the story?
Yeah, yeah.
And what's your music background?
Well, I'll tell you, my brother and I are both spontaneous musicians.
Okay. What does
Yeah,
that
and
mean? What does
I
that
get this.
mean?
Yeah, exactly. Like what? He started to play piano when he was about 12, because my mother bought him a piano for confirmation, and we were raised Lutheran, so in a Lutheran system, you become confirmed at about 12, and it's like the Catholic kids with their first communion when they're about 7. Um, and my parents bought him this old refurbished piano. It was beautiful, and so he just started to play. Just okay, that's a C, that's a D, that's an F, that kind of thing. And I think he could play guitar before that, or he was working on it. He played sax in the school band. Yeah, he was a sax player as well. He could play anything he could pick up. He was really a prodigy. You know, and he taught me a few things about the piano, and then left. To go off on an adventure or something like that. And when he came back, I could play the piano better than he could, and that pissed him off. But now he's totally cool. I've done some studio tracks with this, but basically we're self-taught. And the thing that I did to teach myself is I would get the fake book, you call it, for an artist, for an album that I really liked, and I would go by the guitar tab, because it would list E minor, E minor 7, all of that thing, and I would listen to the record, and I would go through and try and make sense of it. And it was very slow, and I gave up many times. And then I got to college. I was in a couple of bands in high school, and when I got to college, I would get really, really frustrated with what I was studying, because it was a bio major and a psych minor. I wanted to go into animal behavior because it's fascinating, still fascinates me. And I'd get frustrated, and I'd go down to the music wing, and I'd steal a rehearsal piano. I'd go in and close the door behind me, and I would just bang on this rehearsal piano, and it was banging with intention. And one day, my guidance counselor is walking by, and he stops, backs up, opens the door. Is that you playing like that? I said, yeah. Why? And he goes, you're in the wrong program. Closed the door, walked away. And maybe 4 days later or something like that, his wife, who was my chemistry professor, did the same thing. And I'm like, okay, I gotta look at this thing seriously. So I seriously started to, deliberately started to, work on things and have a repertoire. But I did go back when I was in my early 30s. I studied with a woman in New York City for a few years. And I used to call her the jazz Nazi. Because she wanted me to play jazz, and she wanted me not to play these progressive rock songs that I was coming up with. And it wasn't a very good relationship, and you need a really good relationship for something like that. But it was a few years. I learned a lot of theory, and the scales and the modes, and that kind of thing. And I just practice. Um, People get, weird when I tell that I tell that story, especially after they hear me, what I've written.
So the first rock opera was what was it about? What was it? What's the title?
It was called The Children of Children, and it was a father who refused to divorce his kids.
Uh-huh.
We took the paradigm and flipped it on his head
Yeah.
intentionally because I knew a lot of guys that were going through it. I knew there were a lot of suicides in Australia, around Christmas because of it. They couldn't see their kids. It got picked up when we released it. We started sending it out to sites that would play it, and progressive rock review sites, and the reviews were very good. And it got picked up by a guy in Germany named Litter Dittmar, who went by the moniker Lord Litter, used to crack me up. And he spread it across the Radio Marabou network, all the way across Europe and down into Southeast Asia and to Australia. And it got, and then all the way back up across Canada and some places, in the empty bits out west, out there. And then it got picked up by the one remaining radio ship in the North Sea.
Hmm.
You know the story of that? You know of those? Yeah, a lot of
Yes.
people don't even know they exist.
Yeah.
But that film Pirate
Pirate
Radio is
ships.
about,
Yeah.
yeah, is about that. And the guy sent, the guy from Pirate Radio, he said it was called Radio Seagull, then, but he sends me this email and he goes, "We're going to play the whole thing on Christmas." And I went, "What?" And he goes, "Yeah, we're going to play the whole thing on Christmas." And I went, "This is not Christmas fair. This is a dark story. It has a happy ending, but it's a dark story. I don't want you really, I don't want you to increase anybody's pain this time of year." And he says, "Dude, you have no idea how many people need to hear this." And I said, "Okay, okay." And I went back upstairs where my wife was cooking. She was like, "What was that about?" You know?
So is it available online?
Yeah, all of our stuff is available online. If you Google the band name, Madmen and Dreamers,
Uh-huh.
you'll find everything. Everything. Yeah, you'll
Well,
you'll find stuff about me. You'll find stuff about Chris. You find all of the stuff we ever recorded. There's a bunch of stuff out on SoundCloud that are recording releases. They're not final releases. The Water Incorporated is on every download site you can imagine at this point. I was really, really happy the other day. I realized we're on Pandora. I guess we made it, right? Yeah.
very good. Very
But
good.
it's on Spotify, it's on Amazon, I think it's on Apple. But that the label does that, for me. With the Children of Children, it moves so fast. I did it all myself. I couldn't get a label involved in it. They were interested. They said, "Wow, it's an interesting project," and they hand me the CD, the CD back. But the timing of Water, is scary. you know, we we weren't going to pursue it. We really didn't know when we moved down here what we were going to do with it. We worked it. We got, and my son had a conversation with a guy at church about it. And the guy said to my son, "Your father has a rock opera about water." And Andrew says, "Yeah, he does." He goes, "I need to know this man." And he tracked me down. "Your son told me," and I went, "Uh-oh." And he told me all about it. And he, through a lot of different means, I don't know how, religious anybody is that's listening to this or not, but here in North Carolina, they do this thing called community groups where you get together and discuss things. And he put me through this like special abbreviated, lesson or with it, and just kind of convinced me that I didn't really have the choice not to do it. And I said, "Okay, if I can raise the money, we'll do it. This is difficult, it's stressful, it's expensive, but we'll do it." And he said, "Okay, that's all I could ask for." And here we are. I got my first record label at 65 years old,
Congratulations.
which is hilarious.
Well, the great business management writer Peter Drucker wrote I think 30 books after he was 65.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you
So
can get a lot done when you're retired.
that's right.
I'm having a blast.
Me too. Me too.
You know, I welcome retirement. One of my best friends, Mario, who's Nancy's husband, he said to me, a couple of years ago, he goes, when you get to be retirement age, retire. He said, you've been through a lot. You've been through a lot of BS, with what you were doing. Retire. I have a friend. He said, no, retire at 70. He died at 67. And I went, that sucks. He said, yeah, retire. So I listened to him, going, I was like, okay, I hear Mario in the back of my head going, retire, Mark, retire. And I retired, and now I can do stuff.
When I turned 70, I never do birthday parties. I'm not interested in my birthday. When I turned 70, I decided I need to recognize this. I ended up having three birthday parties over 2 weeks, and
Cool.
and they were fantastic. And at one of them, I gave a talk. Of course, if I'm gonna host a party, I'm gonna give a talk because that's
Yes.
what I like to do. And so I talked about my third half of life, which
Yes.
what I'm going to do over the next 30 years. And I plan to publish my last book on my 100th birthday. That's
Yep.
the plan. And I think when you have a plan that extends out to 100 years of age, you approach everything else differently. You don't see um, time as fleeting and dissipating into the ether. You see,
Yeah.
okay, I only have a short period of time to accomplish all these things I want to do. And
Yes.
there's not pressure there. It's not stressful. It's just opportunity that, okay, I have still opportunities.
Yes.
Have to
Yes.
somehow financially make it through for the next 30 years, as we all do.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. There's an interesting thing in my daughter-in-law family. People write memoirs as they age, so that the information is captured. And I thought that was a really, really sweet idea. And my son came to me, they both did, I said, would you please write, a memoir for us? And I went, okay. And I'm working on it, a little bit at a time. It's an interesting exercise. It really, really is. You think back to things with the perspective of time and hopefully an increasingly mature viewpoint, about things and when you go near things that you screwed up, you kind of wince and go, yeah, I should have done that differently. It's an interesting exercise. And I've also told them, I said, you better be good to me because I intend to live to be 100.
Yeah. Well, I think if you have done the same thing over and over again from years to year, decades to decades, then it's hard to imagine what writing a memoir would look like. But
Yeah.
if you've constantly changed, which is what I've done, I've not stand still at all. There's a reason for a memoir, but actually what I find is that in order to explain yourself, you're constantly speaking out of a kind of a memoir storyline every day because you're having to explain why am I different than everyone else out there?
Yeah.
And we're not really different, but the experience that we've had is different because we've done all kinds of different things. And we make decisions I mean, like 10 years ago, I made the decision to quit everything I had been doing and start over. And I moved
Hmm.
from Asheville, where I was living, to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I
Wow.
literally started over. And I'm still in that mode of starting over 10 years later, trying to figure out
It's
what am I doing? Well, I'm
it's fun.
writing, podcasting, but is that all that I'm doing? I don't know.
Yeah, it's truly a weird thing. I really have to do it, as well as from the memoir point of view, because I'm the last grandpa.
Uh,
My daughter-in-law's father died 2 years ago, I want to say, and it was completely preventable. And my daughter-in-law was very upset, by the whole thing. She's a nurse, so she knew exactly what was going on.
Oh my.
And my ex-wife's husband was taken out by COVID,
Hmm.
and he was one of the grandpas too. And I tell you, I felt so bad for her. All of our differences aside, as she put it, she said, I watched my husband die for 28 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really, really tough. And, we see each other fairly regularly because of the grandkids, and we get along okay, which is good. But I'm the last grandpa, and my grandkids have come to me, particularly about the motorcycle that's just outside the window here. They're like, Grandpa, I know you've been riding since you were like 10 years old. We don't want to lose you too.
There's a story there that's worthy of the title of The Last Grandpa.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. That's actually a really good idea. Let me make a note of that.
Yeah, because so what I'm looking at, as I'm focused on time, I'm addressing what is the difference between the past, the present, and the future. And if you know anything about postmodern thought, they don't really see that there's a difference. Everything is kind of captured by the present, and so I'm working off this idea that the past is really something that we know as generational memory. We know it
Hmm.
is through the stories that our generations before us has told us. And I can go back to the um, 1730s and know of stories of family because that's when my father's family came over from Germany. And then the 1750s,
Ah,
when some of my mother's family came over from Scotland, and then the early 1800s, and some of my mother's family came over from Moravia in Germany. And those stories define us. And I'm going to say something that people have heard me say before, but when I was 12 years old, my grandmother, my mother's mother, there's a lot of story behind this, but she told me, says, you may do anything you want, but do not bring shame to the family name.
exactly.
And that story there is about generational memory and honoring the but
Yeah,
what does that mean for the present? And what I found is that people take the past and they kind of encase that in kind of a box, and they say that's important, and we're going to protect the memory. When in reality, what we're supposed to do is take that memory and live it out in some new way in the present.
yeah,
And the challenge is that if you think there's no past and there's no future, then all you have is the eternal present. And
yeah,
if you read T.S. Eliot, the beginning of the Four Quartets, he's basically said if the present and future is encased, I mean the past and the present is encased in the present, then you have no time, and it's a problem. So I see that the future then is really about desire. What is it that we desire for our lives, and how can we live that desire out all the way through the end? As my track coach in high school said, you run through the finish line, not to it. So how do you
yeah,
run through the finish line of your life so that you have something that other people can look back on and say, well, they really made a difference. That's kind of embedded in the story I'm trying to figure out how to tell in this book.
yeah. That's a good one. That's a good idea.
We'll see.
Yeah,
Proof is in the pudding.
yeah. The shame thing really hits home. Too. There have been some characters before me that were kind of not very good to the whole to the whole thing. My family came over here in the late 1800s or early 1900s, mostly from Germany and Norway. My father's mother was Norway, and her maiden name is Jurgensen, and she used to say that the Norse table grace, por de gusto gaben, and she would go through that whole thing, and we got her to say it into a recorder before she passed. Because I said to my dad, I said, "You've got to hold on to that."
Yeah,
It's. I have never seen her version of it, anywhere else. Um, but
that's great.
yeah, yeah, it's really cool. And we find out we had stories in the family, and one character just like dropped off the face of the earth at some point. He just vanished. And so my son, the weekend that he told me I was going to be a grandpa, that Andres, Catherine was pregnant with Andres, he flips around his laptop and he says, "I found the whole family." And he shows me a Facebook page. It's called Durstewitz Worldwide United. I I kid you not. And it's entirely in German. And
Wow.
he goes, "Can you translate that?" I said, "You got a month?" I can get around in German. I can't. I'm not fluent. This is going to take a while. You know, but I met cousins I didn't know I had. We had conversations that I didn't, ever think was going to happen. So the family, has its good stuff attached to it, and and we're all trying to, to make
So
it.
is the spelling of your name the same as it was when they came over?
Yes.
See, my name Brenegar is not spelled the same way as it was when Vythe Brenegar came over in 1730, and it got, I guess immigration and all that changed it, and then family conflicts changed it, and so it's what it is today. And oh, I guess it was 8 years ago or so, I was in Germany visiting a friend, and she took me up to the little town north of Stuttgart where she was born. It's a little medieval village. It has a big clock tower, and on the clock tower, on the one side of the clock tower, is this probably 10-foot tall World War I statue of a German soldier that had been presented to the town in 1935 by the Nazi Party.
Oh
The
boy.
other side of the clock tower was this frieze, this concrete frieze of the names of the men from the village who had fought in the First World War, and there was G. Brenegar spelled in the same way as it was in 1730.
Oh, that's good.
And I thought, so this is where I'm from. And
Yeah.
it was just this wonderful, beautiful moment in time.
We have and this really shocked me when going through the Facebook uh, page that Andrew showed me and doing some research on my own. There is a forest in Germany, Waldurstwitz, named after us. I don't know why. And there's a hill in that forest, and I don't know the word for hill. And on that hill, there's a Bronze Age burial.
Huh. Interesting.
So, yeah, it is, and nobody knows why our name is associated with it. Nobody's been able to figure it out. We probably came from the East at some point, because there were records that my son got, from that were published online by the German government, but they're all written in old German script, and he couldn't read it. Yeah, so he sent me the link. He goes, "Can you read this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I can pick through it." But it said Slavish next to our name, which is from the East. So we really don't know for sure where it comes from, but we got this really nice window about maybe 3000 BC here.
So when you say the East, are you talking about Prussia? Are you talking about Czechoslovakia?
Could be. Well, we're in the northeast of Germany. That's where Thuringia is, up there. At least I think that's where it is.
Up near
Uh,
Poland?
yeah, it might be from Poland. It might be from beyond Poland. You've got those Latvia and Moravia,
Hmm.
there. So we're not 100% sure. I used to know a bunch of people who lived in an Orthodox monastery, and I was there for 2.5 years because it was do that or be homeless, when the market went south on me. And I learned a lot. And I talked to the people there. They're Serbian and Croats, and there was a very old Russian monk there. And he was hard to he was hard to get when he was lucid. But one day I was talking to him, and Durstewitz, he said, this is a Russian name. I was like, really? He goes, it's a Russian name. So later I talked to Liliana, the one from Serbia, and her husband, Branko, who, believe it or not, is in the World Book, because he played the longest time as a center on the Yugoslav national rugby team. His last name is Pieper, Piper. And he said, yes, this name comes from the East, maybe Poland, like that. Yeah, so
So,
it's interesting. We're not 100% sure.
so this would be the Germanic form of a Russian Slavic name.
Possibly. Possibly. There are street signs over there where it's spelled where the U is an O with an umlaut, which is basically the same sound. My son said he found a record that it was in a marriage license, that it was Durstewitz going in and Durstewitz coming out. He said somebody just, renamed it or something, but over in Germany.
That's
I was
fascinating.
like, that's weird. Well, all the towns, they had their own language, basically. They had their own dialect. So it was really hard to track it down, based on the records. And so much burned from World War II.
One of the things I'm interested in, and I've asked this of some of the people that have been on the show from Europe, is what was the world like there prior to all the revolutions? And we'd have to go back to before, the English Revolution, most likely, but to figure out. And one of the guests was Anders Ambelt, who's from Denmark, and his family had a farm down on the Russian border, and he can talk about what it was like back then, and that to me is just so fascinating because in many respects, our stories are a reflection of what we remember, and the stories
Yes,
change, but they still have a character to them of remembering both the good things, but also the traumatic things that happened
yes.
to us.
There is a thing called genetic memory,
Hmm.
and it's very real. I saw a paper done where they were looking at the genome from the descendants from the people who were in the concentration camps, and they had all of the markers for post-traumatic stress disorder 2 and 3 generations later. So they had the symptoms. The symptomology was there, even though they had been exposed to no trauma. So it's fascinating the way we keep things, like that. I don't know why, but
Well,
yeah,
there's a guy that has a YouTube channel named Mark Leta, and it's called Soft White Underbelly. And he was a fashion photographer in New York, and then went to LA and set up a studio on Skid Row, and he started interviewing people on Skid Row,
the home,
prostitutes,
yeah,
homeless people, alcoholics, drug addicts, former criminals, every all the lowest level of society's damaged goods, so to speak.
yeah, they're always damaged.
And it's very interesting how many of those people are the products of parenting and grandparenting that had also been very destructive.
Yeah,
And of these children, and they don't come out of it very well. And it really points to how we're not individuals. We really are the extension of families over
yes,
time.
yes, we are, and we are an extension of families that need better stories.
So your recognition of the importance of being the grandfather, the last grandfather, I think I
Yeah,
just wanted to kind of come back to say that's very important for your grandchildren and your great
yes,
grandchildren.
yes. I have been riding a motorcycle since I'm about 10 years old. I was dirt bikes all the way up until I was about 40. And then I stopped riding in the dirt for a while because frankly, it just beats the crap out of you. You have to be in really good shape. You have to know how to fall. You always come back bruised, right? But it's great fun. So I stopped doing that. And then the gas prices in New Jersey went up to where it was costing me $100 to fill the car. I had expensive commuting. I was going from where I lived in New Jersey all the way out near the Tappan Zee Bridge, which is where the current job was. I said to my wife, I said, "This is ridiculous. I'm not gonna blow that kind of money. I can get a motorcycle, and it will the payment for the motorcycle will be less than the gas I used
Yeah.
in the truck." And it was, but I wore all kinds of gear with it because I raced off road a few times. I know how banged up you can get. You can get really banged up. So I always had the protective gear, and that's probably why I almost always came back in one piece. But I was riding down here, with it a little bit, taking it in the town, into Charlotte and stuff. And then when all of this happened with my daughter-in-law's dad, um, my two oldest grandkids, Andres and Amelia, came to me and said, "We really can't afford to lose you too, Grandpa." And I went, "Okay, that's valid. That's valid. I'll get rid of it." So right now I'm working on it to making sure it's running really, really well so I can get the best buck out of
Yeah.
it.
But that's all they needed to say.
Yes, that's all they needed to say. My son and I joked about it afterwards. He goes, "Dad, you've had a really good run. You've ridden longer than anyone I know without any serious injury." He goes, "It's time to quit." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know. It's the same thing with your kids." But yeah, that's,
Well, you've lived a very interesting life.
yes. And I intend to make it more interesting as I go.
But let me ask you one last question, and I often ask this question. So as you look to the future, what do you have hope for? Or where do you find hope?
I, I have hope and faith in most people. Um, People that are in and around the arts, the vast majority of them look to the future with hope because so much of what we do is about hope and it requires a look into the future. I really do wish we would get uh, our political problems squared away because that causes a certain amount of intestinal, dislike. But we need to stop messing with each other. We need not to have weapons that can annihilate civilization on this planet. We need to beat climate change. People do not understand what's coming. They do not. I've been studying it for 2 decades now, maybe 3 decades now. And what's coming is we're playing on the tracks of an oncoming train. And it's not a freight train, it's an express. And we really, really, really need to stop this. I have never in my life seen evil so breathtaking as the people that seem to think they just need a few more dollars to stick into their already crammed pockets, because that's exactly why we're not doing enough.
Hmm.
We need to change that.
Well, that's the moment, the transition moment that we're in, and
Yeah,
and it's clear to me that it's not going. We're not going to go backwards. And
no,
what we've been in the midst of is not sustainable. So something new
no.
is going to emerge, and the question is, are we prepared to walk into that new frame of mind and new way of being a society? And I'm hopeful for that. I think the things I've
Me
seen
too.
since COVID tells me that people recognize that more and more people are recognizing that things they need to change, not just the world needs to change. So here we go. Let's go do it.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
it's been great to have you, and I enjoy getting to know you, and I hope we can get together down there in Charlotte, and maybe do lunch or
yeah. Go have a
whatever.
beer or
I'd
something.
love to.
You know.
And but thank you for coming on, and I'll see you soon, and thank you all for watching, and I hope this has been fun for you. And if anything, go reach out to your family and say,
Yeah.
"How you doing? I love you." And
Yeah.
let's talk about what matters to us as a family,
Whatever kind of family you have.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Mark, and thank you all, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.
Thank you, Ed.